I'm joined by Costas Lapavitsas, former Syriza MP, economics professor and author of the new book, The Left Case Against the European Union. Costas, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So why was the EU created?
Well, it was originally not the EU, of course. It was basically a deal between France and Germany to create protection for markets and to create something that would support the steel and coal industry. People forget that. They think it was originally created to defend peace in Europe and everything else. No, it was a business proposition to defend particular sectors of the economy. At the same time, it was also a deal to protect agriculture, provide better prices for French agriculture. That's how it began. Not with high ideals, not with any kind of intention to alter Europe dramatically from the days of fascism and war and so on. Then gradually it became other things. As the decades wore on, it became something else. And now it's basically a neoliberal machine that imposes market discipline, a machine that serves the interests of big business against labor, and a machine that defends the interests of some countries against others. There's no doubt at all about it.
So if you could pinpoint when this began to happen, what historical moment was it where we can say this is when the European Union became a neoliberal institution?
Late 80s is when this begins to emerge clearly. The late 80s are the time when we know something is in the offing, with Jacques Delors being the main man in the European Union, pushing for the single market and so on. And the Maastricht Treaty and everything that followed after that really signals it and sums it up. Once that became the point of reference for the functioning of the European Union, then the rule of neoliberalism is indisputable, became indisputable. Then an entire set of institutions and structures was then put in place that made that certain, that made the rule of the market dominant.
One of which was the Eurozone, European Central Bank. These all grow out of that particular moment,
Of course, because single market went with single currency. Now, Britain was fortunate never to go into the single currency, so it is frequently easy to forget that. But the single market, about which so much is being said in this country now, went with the single currency. Single market, single currency are pillars of neoliberalism. That's what secures neoliberalism in Europe, because they carry an entire raft of institutions around them. People misunderstand that. They're very powerful institutions which are undemocratic, unaccountable, hugely powerful economically, socially and politically. And that's what makes Europe tick. That's how it runs.
So why was the euro set up?
The euro was set up as an important counterpart to the single market, as I've said. Now, from an economic perspective, and if you deal with it through economic theory, in truth, they didn't have to do it. They could have had a kind of single market without a single currency, but they were taken up they were taken in by the ideology of the time and all the talk about the triumph of the market. You still don't forget those were the days of triumphant markets, because the Soviet Union had also collapsed, and it seemed that free market capitalism was the order of the day. So they wanted to create a single currency as well that would solidify, presumably, the single market, and it would also bind together more strongly the countries that were participating in the single market. Now, in that, the main mistake was made by the French politically, because the main force pushing for it, the single currency, was France, thinking that through the single currency mechanisms, European Central Bank, the Euro groups and everything that came after that, it would be able to control German decision-making and German interests in Europe. Well, it's the biggest historic miscalculation in Europe in a very long time, because that's not how it turned out. It turned out that Germany was benefited from that.
It strikes me, that's exactly how I read it in the book. It strikes me that there are two sort of decisive moments for you, one of which, of course, is 2008. The other is 1992, the Maastricht Treaty. And that brings together two very important historical events. One is German reunification, the other is the end of history. And it seems to me like the euro is a synthesis of capitalist realism. There is an alternative. Therefore, we can do this single market, single currency. And at the same time thinking, well, clearly German hegemony is impossible because of the end of history and because we'll tie them into this broader entity. And yet, paradoxically, what they've done is revivified a certain kind of history of European conflict, of certain European countries dominating and domineering others.
Absolutely, but then that's how capitalism works. I mean, you imagine that you set certain things in motion, and you do, and you imagine that you've got full control of events, but you don't. Reality emerges further down the line, and it looks very different from what you planned. And this is what has happened to the French, but also to the Germans. I mean, you mustn't think that because Germany has come to dominate, everything in the garden is rosy and everything is, no, not at all for Germany and for the German people. But if we go back to who planned it and how, yeah, that was an incredible time, which I remember very well, of course, because I was around at the time, of incredible confidence and arrogance of these people, that any idea of socialism is dead, any idea of collective action is dead, any idea of planning and controlling the capitalist economy is nonsense, and we want individualism, we want private freedom in economic policy, we want institutions that guarantee that, and then as we do this, we will also make sure that Germany is controlled and follows, plays by the rules, because obviously now it's been reunified. And that's what they did. And, you know, some of us argued at the time, that's not how it's going to be. But it was a very small voice drowned in a sea of optimism and so on. And of course we were right. We were right. What has emerged is divergence, fragmentation, hierarchy, and profound economic instability in Europe. It's been a disaster. And I repeat, you know, they didn't have to have the single currency. It was just overreach. Enormous arrogance and miscalculation. Here we are.
And whose economic interests does the Eurozone extend and expand today?
Quite clearly German interests. On that, there's no doubt. The only country that has clearly benefited from the euro is Germany, and I want to explain how, because that's complex too. There are some other countries close to the German industrial and economic core that have also benefited, but they're smaller. Among the big beasts of Europe, Germany is the clear winner. And it has benefited in ways that, in some ways, the Germans themselves did not expect. And that's, again, the law of unintended consequences in capitalist economy. Because what Germany did was to adopt a policy domestically of basically beating the working class, freezing wages, dismantling labor protection, disrupting all the previous practices of the labor market. People in this country still have an idea of German social democracy at work and elsewhere. They are 30 years out of date. The German labor market is a ruthless place right now, and it has become so the last few decades as the country headed towards the single market, the single currency. That's what they did. Right? They did that thinking that in this way they would be able to reunify the country more successfully and defend their place in the new European market. And the results were astounding for them, because in effect what they did by keeping wages down and basically putting all the pressure on domestic labor was to create a tremendous competitive advantage for their own exporting industries. The real winners of this are German industrial exporters, the car business, the machine tool sector, the chemical industry, the core of German capitalism. They created a tremendous competitive advantage for these people on price terms, not because of investment again, because people get these things wrong. There's little investment in Germany. Actually, Germany needs investment badly.
And productivity is not
Productivity is not doing anything very much. They've suppressed wages so ruthlessly and disrupted conditions for labor so ruthlessly. They've gained a tremendous advantage. They've dominated the European market as a result. They've turned it into a domestic market, you see. Because in the past, Italy, for instance, or France would have devalued their own national currencies. And Germany would not have been able to dominate their markets, but now they can, or at least in the 2000s they could. So they dominated. Once that had happened, obviously the crisis followed, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But after the crisis, what happened among the Germans, the German big business, is that they were able, on the basis of the Eurozone, the domination of the Eurozone, to make a huge leap across the world and to begin to export globally. And they've emerged as a phenomenal exporter. Germany right now is the biggest, proportionately the biggest exporter in the world. It's a vast surplus. It's clearly an untenable situation for Europe and for the world. The only person who's talking about it, incidentally, openly and aggressively, is President Trump, of all people. He's the only person to say that this is not right, right? And it isn't right. But that's where we are. So they've benefited. Now, what does this mean? Tremendous inequality in Germany. The rise in inequality in Germany in the last 20 years is phenomenal. A collapse of labor share in national income. Some very rich people have emerged based on industry, fundamentally. These very rich people want to protect the situation, defend the situation as it is. Basically, German social democracy, as we knew it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is dead, long dead. And that you see politically as well.
But given all of that, the European Union is composed of multiple states, liberal democratic. Some are formally very powerful economic countries. You've already said Italy, a big manufacturing power for the second half of the 20th century. France as well, and Greece. Why did these countries join the Eurozone when it didn't suit their domestic interests? And it's so clearly disadvantaged them, what, a decade and a half in. Why is there still such zealotry for remaining in the Eurozone, even in somewhere like Greece, which has seen its GDP collapse, wages fall, and yet people still are very resistant to the idea of going back to the old currency?
These are two separate questions, and there are different answers within those questions, each of those questions. The reason why various different countries joined the project differed according to the size of the country. For the French, as I've already indicated, it was, they thought, a means of controlling a reunified Germany. For smaller countries, and this to a certain extent includes Italy, joining the euro was partly the result of the poor experience of managing commercial relations and balance of trade and balance of payment imbalances in Europe in the previous period. Because Europe, you see, had failed time and again to secure some kind of amicable arrangement of these things. Germany was at the heart of it again because it manipulated the exchange rate of the Deutschmark. But for the smaller countries, the crucial issue was that every time they developed a balance of trade deficit, they had to devalue. And these devaluations were difficult, not every time, but whenever they developed a persistent deficit, they had to devalue. Devaluations were difficult, disruptive. They caused political and social disruption within those countries. Italy was affected, France was also affected. For a smaller country like Greece, it was very, very difficult to deal with these pressures every so often. So a common currency seemed to be a very nice arrangement. Here is an idea that would make even democratic sense, they thought, you see. We create a common currency, we create institutions that support the common currency. These institutions are run on the basis of equal participation by the various member states of the Eurozone. We have a democratic say according to our size, and decisions are reached on the basis of unanimity. Seem to make sense, right? We have the ECB that would protect us, and stability will reign. And that is still, some people are still attempting to sell that myth about the euro. That's how it was created, right? So the Greeks, for instance, and others went in because of that. Now, for a short period after joining, and because this was a single monetary sphere, interest rates came down. They came down basically to German levels, as they had to, because if you got a single currency, that's what would happen. For the smaller countries, this was an incredible boon. Suddenly the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Greeks, and a variety of others could borrow even personally, for their own personal expenses and so on incredibly low interest rates. It seemed that the euro had not only done away with instability of the exchange rate and the instability of foreign trade, but also allowed us to borrow and to enjoy prosperity by consuming and having all these things, buying a house and all that. Then, of course, the disaster of the crisis followed. But the myth of the prosperity period of the euro is still about. The real reason, though, why they're not leaving is not that. The real reason is the fear of leaving. And that is something that the euro has delivered to all capital in Europe, not just Germany. It's an incredible trap that has been created in Europe, a monetary trap. And monetary traps are the most invidious of them all because you don't see them and you don't understand how they work openly. It's a trap that ties workers and ties smaller countries into it and threatens them with incredibly negative consequences if they decide to get out. And that also can be understood by a lot of ordinary people because they have savings, because they rely on money for their everyday transactions. So if you tell them that there's going to be monetary instability and you're going to lose your savings, they get scared. Fear. And this fear supports the euro. It's a club that has been joined by many people who would like to leave, but they fear the consequences of leaving right now. Fear holds the euro together, above all.
So we know what holds the euro together. Let's talk about the EU. Personally speaking, I'm far more pessimistic about the future of the euro than the EU. I think the EU could have centuries, decades, who knows, like any political union. I think the euro, because of some of the contradictions you've outlined, probably is living on borrowed time as it's presently configured. If we're talking about a project to democratise Europe, as some have said here in Britain in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, remain and reform for a people's Europe, you seem quite sceptical about that in the book. Can you outline some of the arguments as to why you think that a democratic European Union isn't possible?
I'm not just skeptical about it, I'm outright dismissive of it. And let me just say, this isn't something that, I've always believed in or I automatically believed in. This is a position to which I've come through experience, basically, and by observing the beast closely for several years, actually in operation, being involved in the politics of it. So let me say at the outset, those who believe that they can reform the European Union in a sort of progressive, left-wing, pro-Labour direction are living in cloud cuckoo land. They don't understand what it is. They are the real utopians. They've got no idea what they're dealing with here. I can back this up in a variety of ways. I can first of all tell you a few things about the institutions of it. The European Union is fundamentally democratic in the first instance. Even those who defend it know it. There is a big academic literature on the democratic deficit, so-called. Well, this democratic deficit has become a democratic abyss the last 10 years. And I say this advisedly because presumably, since the crisis, we would have expected some improvement of the thing. Well, actually, it's become worse, and that's not accidental. So the democratic deficit is vast, and you can see it in real terms. It doesn't matter what you vote for in Europe or who you vote for. In the end of the day, the policies that the governments are allowed to apply are the same. In other words, economic policy and to a certain extent social policy has been depoliticized. Well, that is the definition of the emasculation of democracy across the continent, understood by working people perfectly well. So democracy doesn't work, and it doesn't work in these crucial ways because economic and social policy is dictated by unelected, unaccountable institutions which are enormously powerful. If you are in the single currency, the Eurogroup is the key thing. The EMS is the key thing. If you're not, The Commission still has a say on your budget and the way things are operated, for the government, but also more generally. You can't intervene very much.
But why can't those be changed? Is there not a possibility here that you're essentializing? Because clearly any political institution is socially contested, changed over time. We've already talked about how the EU changed dramatically after 1992 and Maastricht, and that responded to the end of history, or so we thought. Can't that happen again in a more progressive direction?
I'll give you two answers for that. The first is called the European Court of Justice, which, again, people underestimate how powerful it is. The European Court of Justice is a strange institution, arguably the strangest institution in Europe, because it has its authority delegated to it by the states that comprise the Union. And yet, it has sort of pulled itself up by its own bootstraps and elevated itself above national legislatures and considers itself to be dominant over them and sets the terms of legal reference over crucial issues. Anything to do with European law or comes anywhere near issues that affect how the Union operates, and there's a vast array of these issues. In the end of the day, it's the European Court of Justice that decides, and that finds systematically in favor of capital against labor, in favor of neoliberal unification against it, and against any attempts to attack it. So that will be the first enemy, and an implacable enemy, that any attempt to change the European Union will come across. Second reason I can give you is, of course, the nature of European politics at the level of the Union. Again, people misunderstand. They think that the European Parliament is a parliament, like the national parliament is. Or they think that European politics occurs and takes place in the same way as national politics. It doesn't. National politics, we understand. Parties, social interests expressed through parties, they conflict, they oppose each other. Policy is made according to who controls the levers of power through elections and otherwise in the streets and so on. Why? Because there is a commonality, there is an entity that makes up the country, the nation and the demos, right? That's what democracy is. No such thing in Europe. There is no single overarching nation, no single overarching demos in Europe. And that is reflected in political organization. The parties in the European Parliament are not parties in the sense that we see them in this country, Britain, or in Greece or elsewhere. They're coalitions of political entities loosely allied to each other that might or might not defend certain interests depending on their own national interests and so on. That's the politics of it. So those who make the decisions at that level are basically the council, in other words, ministers that come from, or prime ministers that come from their own countries. And so the notion that you can actually change this through a concerted democratic effort or individual democratic effort is just, it doesn't compute.
But for a pro-European, they would say, well, Germany wasn't a political entity until the 1860s, 1870, same with Italy. The United States underwent something relatively similar, even had a civil war to determine whether it was a confederation or a federation of states. Massimo d'Azeglio, the Italian statesman, put it well. He said, we've made Italy, now we must make Italians. Why is it any different in Europe? We've made the European Union, now we must make Europeans. Or is that... We've tried. So you categorically think that's impossible? Because that would be the argument that would be put to you by a Remain reformer.
Not so much in Europe now. This is an argument that one comes across in this country, which has become strongly Europhile, some sections of it, strongly Europhile in the last few years, and that to me is an incredible surprise. And it's almost like Britain is catching up with these arguments. I used to have a lot of purchase on the continent a few years back. Not many people come up with that stuff now on the continent because they've come to realize that this is about 10, 20 years out of date. What I would say about that is this. Yes, nations are created. They are constructs. They're constructs of the mind, of course, we know that. Many people have established this, but they're actually constructs of reality, and we must not underestimate that. In other words, they're not fictitious. They do exist. They do exist, even if people imagine them to a certain extent, but nonetheless, they do exist. They come into existence not through careful and calibrated arguments by some intellectuals or very intelligent people at universities or think tanks or whatever, but they come into existence through real social action that is often bloody, turbulent and tempestuous. You yourself mentioned civil wars and so on. How exactly will that happen in Europe? I mean, what would be the process? How would you turn this menagerie of 27 different nations into a single nation? Who would support this idea, and how would that come about on the ground? How? That is utopian. That is a pipe dream. One last thing I would say on that. I would be willing to give this idea some credence and to pursue it a bit if I could see any evidence that the project of the European Union, originally when it was the steel and coal outfit, or even later when it became the European Union, in some important way emanated from the bottom up. If there was any evidence of that, I'd say, okay, let's give it a little bit of time to consider it. But no, at every critical juncture, this project has been from the top to bottom. That's how it's worked. And you can see it. The working people in Britain and elsewhere in Europe have got very little love, for the European Union.
So your former colleague and compatriot, Yanis Varoufakis, would say that we have to be in and against the European Union. Britain shouldn't leave. It should, ideally should have remained to change it. The same with Greece. It should really stay in the Eurozone and be part of a broader multinational effort by united lefts and working classes across the continent to make it a more progressive institution. Where do you think Yanis Varoufakis is particularly mistaken in this interpretation? Because you've said there's the absence of a demos. Are there any sort of other category errors he's making which make that an impossibility?
The thing that is absent in what Varoufakis is saying is an understanding of the class nature of this as well. Because these are not class neutral institutions. In the end, they're institutions that serve the interests of big business and big capital against labor, as I've already indicated. And when you're confronting these institutions, class interest will manifest itself clearly and forcefully. You might have the best arguments in the world. You might be able to tell them, look, austerity doesn't work. And you might be able to write a very good academic paper on that, which might get published in a very good academic journal. But in the realm of politics, that's not how it works, because class interest will tell in the end, and your argument will be dismissed. And it is this which is entirely absent, I feel, from what Varoufakis is saying about Europe, because the class interests that wish the present dispensation to continue in Europe, they're ruthless, they're unbending. And it's obvious from how they're behaving. 10 years into the crisis, nothing's changed. Nothing.
One of the primary ways in which Germany exercises informal power over the rest of the European Union is through being a creditor nation. And this really came to the fore after the 2010 crisis. So it exercises informal power, which has increasingly become political and economic power, through running budget surpluses and through being this creditor nation. Is it fair to say that the relationship between Germany and much of the rest of the European Union, particularly the Eurozone, is analogous to that between a conqueror and a conquered state?
It's too strong. That is too strong. And I would never say that. I would say that...
So how would you describe... Because when we think about capital and labour going from peripheral states to core states, we tend to think of that being imperialism. So how would you describe it?
I would say Germany is hegemonic, but this hegemony is conditional hegemony. And maybe an analogy with the United States would help. The United States emerged as a hegemonic power in 1945. It had won the war for the West, and so on. We don't have to go over it. And it emerged as the most powerful economy by a long chalk. And what did it do after that? It established the institutions through which the post-war world was structured. The Bretton Woods institutions, The United States created those institutions. It created them in its own image and according to its own precepts and choices and interests, of course. John Maynard Keynes tried to have a different argument about the IMF, and he was told by his US counterpart, who intellectually was not in the same universe as Keynes, but he was told by his American counterpart, look, this is the United States speaking, and that's what's going to happen. So he did. The United States shaped the world. Look at Germany. Germany did not create the European Union, and it did not create the monetary union, and it did not create these institutions because it was hegemonic in the first instance, and it could shape those institutions to project its power and to shape Europe as it saw fit. Germany became hegemonic through the institutions. The institutions were established in the first place in a complex way, which we've discussed. Germany found itself in there, and by dint of circumstance, by dint of considerable industrial power, which was there in the first place, and by dint of suppressing its own labor, emerged hegemonic through the institutions. Without the institutions, Germany would not be hegemonic. It's not big enough.
Don't we go back to that quote from Kissinger, where it says, Germany too big for Europe, too small for the world? So with any potential currency union, it was always likely that this would happen.
But now we know it did happen, and we've seen how it happened. Germany, from what we can see from the published evidence and so on, didn't particularly want the euro. France pushed for it, and I'm repeating this because it tells you something about the nature of German hegemony right now, which is real. I don't want to downplay it in the slightest. It's real.
Because the choices made in Berlin determine the future of Europe, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where real power lies.
Yeah.
I mean, Macron imagines that he shapes Europe, but he imagines it like he imagines many other things. Actually, Berlin is where real decisions are made for Europe. But it's important to understand how it's conditional hegemony. In other words, Germany needs the EU. The most committed Europeanists in Europe are Germans, and the German bosses and the German ruling elite, because they know that this defends their interests. In the absence of the European structures, Germany would rapidly diminish in stature across the world. I mean, and this is no speculation. It would happen economically as well, because if it wasn't for the euro, the Deutschmark would appreciate dramatically. Germany would lose command quickly over the European market, and it would be hit between the eyes across the rest of the world as far as its key exporting industries are concerned. German hegemony is very weakly based. Weakly based because it works through the institutions of Europe, and because the German economy is not nearly as efficient and as successful as people imagine. It's not investment, technology, that kind of advance that has made Germany so powerful. It's suppressing its own labor. That's a very weak basis for economic and political hegemony across the world. So that's what I would say about that issue, German hegemony.
So going forward, you've been an MP. You've been at the forefront of confronting some of these institutions, the Eurogroup, the ECB, various ministers from countries in Northern Europe. You've talked about the limited basis upon which Germany exercises hegemony within the European Union, within the Eurozone. What would your advice be to the left in particular, in places like France, Italy, Spain, knowing what you do as somebody who's been operating in politics and with your theoretical views on actually how fragile German hegemony is, what would your advice be?
I'll tell you one thing about the Greek experience, from which I learned a lot because I was involved in it, but also Europe ought to learn much more than it has done already. Because I think the Greek experience has been swept under the carpet by many people on the European left, which astonishes me. I'll tell you one thing from the Greek experience. The main element, the main factor in defeating Syriza, because Syriza basically collapsed and it was completely defeated, accepted the policies that it decried in the first place. The main factor in defeating Syriza were not the lenders. It was not the European Union. It was not the power of the foreigner, let's put it that way. It was domestic. It was the domestic entrenched interests, the domestic Greek elite, the domestic Greek bourgeoisie, the Greek ruling class, that defended its own interests. And to defend its own interests, it knew they had to be in cahoots with the European Union. That's a very, very important point to grasp. The Greek rich and the Greek oligarchs, and they are among the most disgusting people in the world, right? They were adamant about this. They knew it. They understood it, right? And they were unbending in their commitment to the European Union, and that's what basically did for Syriza. Syriza was not prepared to confront these people, to take them on.
So what should the French and the Italian and the Spanish?
That's the first thing. That's the first thing they've got to bear in mind. That whatever they do about the European Union, whatever policies they put on the table to restructure their economies in the interest of working people, they must understand and appreciate that they will be attacking, and they must attack the domestic interest. Otherwise, they will not get anywhere. The same holds for this country, Britain, as well. One must always start from home in this regard, because that's where the danger is. Having said this, and that's how Europe works, you can bet your bottom dollar, or bottom euro in this case, that the domestic elite will seek support in Europe, and the European institutions will be queuing up to provide it. And they will be ruthless. They will be ruthless at it. And in providing support to the domestic elite, whatever the domestic elite might be, they will also be rearranging the hierarchy among them, because that's how capitalist elites always work. If the Greek bourgeoisie is unfortunate to find itself in a weak position, it might be helped by its friends in the European Union, but it will pay a price for it, of course. That's how solidarity works among the rich in Europe or anywhere else. So the Spanish, the Italian, and the French left, but also the German left, and that German left is very interesting because it's the hegemonic country left, should bear in mind that they've got to plan against their own elite, and they should plan against the European Union supporting their elite, and therefore they should put rupture on the table. Rupture must be on the table at all times. If they're not prepared to put rupture on the table, in other words, a break with the institutions that provide the support for domestic class interests, they will get nowhere. They will be eaten alive. The left must recapture some of its radical past, its historic purpose in Europe, and challenge the very existence of the European institutions. Otherwise, what's the left for? And it will never succeed in delivering what it hopes to deliver.
Costas, it was a pleasure.
Pleasure all mine.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.